So as Kate said, my name is Jan Davidson and I'm the museum's historian. And honestly, I'm delighted that this larger crowd came out to hear this topic. There are folks here because they're interested in the material. I think there are folks here because they're interested in seeing our new space. And there are also folks here because I asked them to come. So for all of those groups of people, thank you for showing up today. In November 1898, a violent massacre perpetrated by white supremacists and a coup d'etat changed life in the city of Wilmington, New Hanover County, and the state of North Carolina. And today I'm going to talk about the coup part of this story. First, though, let's go back to right after the Civil War. This was a time of big social, economic, and political changes spurred by the emancipation of previously enslaved people. Emancipation changed the nation, freeing 4 million enslaved people. In places like New Hanover County, where the majority of the population was Black, this had an even more transformative effect. People of all races gained access to better education after the Civil War, and for previously enslaved people who had been legally barred from learning how to read and write, education was seen as an important source of pride, skills, and dignity, and folks flocked to the schoolhouse door of all ages. Some newly freed men and women left their old church congregations to form new churches, creating new religious and community spaces and new opportunities for Black people to lead. And these are from a newspaper in 1897 and just shows a couple of those Black churches. Wilmington became home to men and women like Dr. James Schober and Lucy Hughes Brown, the first male and female licensed Black doctors in North Carolina in the state. It was also home to educators like Williston School Principal Mary Washington Howe, and men like Reverend Daniel Jackson Saunders, who was a minister at Chestnut Street Presbyterian and a newspaper editor in our community. He went on to become the first Black president of Biddle University, which is a Presbyterian HBCU in 1870, and it's now Johnson. That was founded in 1870, and it's now Johnson C. Smith. Along with those changes, we see the economy undergoing a transformation. Farms and businesses that were once run using enslaved labor changed or failed. Some new businesses grew up because of these changes. So the Navassa Guano Fertilizer Company, which created tons of fertilizer after the Civil War, made a product that became more of a priority in the South when you no longer had workers who were enslaved. You were trying to increase the productivity of your farm. And previously enslaved people became entrepreneurs. Carpenters, blacksmiths, seamstresses, butchers, barbers, and other skilled artisans set up shops. Other Black entrepreneurs opened newspapers, stores, and saloons. Overall, by the 1890s, you have 30 plus years of educational, social, and economic changes in a region with a Black majority population, and that helped make New Hanover County and the city of Wilmington a place of visible Black achievement. As those changes occurred, the political life of the nation changed as well. So right after the Civil War, the country struggled with how to let Confederate states back into the US. Congress restarted Reconstruction in 1867 because they thought the president had been too lenient on the South. And so to get readmitted to the US, you had to write a new state constitution that let Black men vote and pass the 14th Amendment. So everyone always talks about the 14th Amendment's equal protection law, due process clause, but the amendment also barred men who had sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution and then broke it during the war from being in office after the Civil War, and in some cases from voting. So a lot of the people in our community who were in government before and during the Civil War were no longer eligible to hold office. And so when we went to rewrite our Constitution in 1868 in order to get back into the Union, newly enfranchised Black men and white Republicans were the source of that constitutional change. And men like Abraham Galloway, who, if you do not know about Abraham Galloway, you should go and find out all you can. He is amazing and an amazing leader for our community. He helped transform the state as a whole by working to create a constitution that gave every Black man, it's only men at the time, the right to vote regardless and hold office, regardless of whether they owned property or their previous condition of servitude. So when we talk about the politics of this era, and I'm talking about this in order to help us understand the coup part of this story, we need to talk about political parties in the 19th century. You need to take all the things you think about today's parties and like throw them out the window. That is not what Republican or Democrat meant in this time frame. And also those meant different things depending on what part of the country that you lived in. So in the South, if you were a Republican after the Civil War in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, you were often African American. You may have moved to the South from the North, and there are then again a small number of white Republicans who are native born. If you are a Democrat, you may have been involved in the Confederacy. You are more likely to have been well-to-do. And then in the 1890s, we get the populists who were a revolt of farmers. And so many of them were poor, white, and Black, and they come into the political picture. So for much of the post-war period, New Hanover County voted for Republicans, white and Black. Black men like Union veteran George W. Price Jr. and William Kellogg, born free before the war, who was a carpenter and a member of Giblin Lodge, were on the Board of Aldermen in the city, which was basically the city council, in 1868. Republican leader Duncan Holmes, who was a wheelwright, served on both the Board of Aldermen and the city and the county commission in the 1870s. And Henry Brewington was a member of the Board of Aldermen in the 1870s, deputy sheriff in the 1880s, and he was also a member of the North Carolina House of Representatives. And in fact, many of our state delegation through this time period were African American. This is a picture from 1874, and all three of the counties state representatives were Black at that time. We don't know which ones they are, but I hope that they're in this picture. And so when we're looking at this picture of the whole of the House of Representatives, that our three, William H. Moore, Henry Brewington, and Alfred Lloyd, are all in there. Also, Abraham Galloway, who I already mentioned, was the area's state senator in 1868. George W. Price Jr. served in both houses of the state government as well. So we have this long tradition, and there's some ups and downs through the 1870s and 80s, but generally, when there are offices to vote for, African Americans get elected. Nowhere near in the numbers of that they actually compose of the population, but still there's a formidable presence of Black legislators in our region. In contrast, the state of North Carolina began to change in the 1870s as some of the gains of Reconstruction were eroded. For example, this is Zebulon B. Vance, who had been Confederate governor of North Carolina, and so was ineligible to vote and stand for office in North Carolina in the late 1860s and early 1870s. In 1875, President Grant signed a bill that gave him and others amnesty, and he was reelected as governor of North Carolina in 1876. And during his tenure, the Democratic state legislature changed the way county commissioners were elected, making them an appointment by the legislature rather than voted for in the region. So there's this 20-year gap where there are no Black county commissioners in New Hanover County, and it's because of what happened at the General Assembly. Still, like I already said, locally, the Republicans still elected people to office throughout the 1870s and 1880s. And so this region, this county, was out of step with much of the rest of the state. In the 1890s, there's some economic depressions, the Great Depression of 1893 and other kinds of economic upheaval. And North Carolina's Republicans and populist parties joined forces against the Democrats. This coalition, called Fusion, worked together and gained power. So Wilmington's politics and state politics came back, were more closely aligned in the 1890s. Together, the parties won the majority in the state legislature that led to a Republican and populist senator representing the state in Washington. And then Republican Governor Daniel L. Russell was elected. And in the northern part of the state, George White became a Black congressman for North Carolina, and he ended up being the last Black legislator in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. This coalition also gave back power to local governments. Black and white Republicans in our region and elsewhere benefited from fusion. In 1896, the local Republicans won seats on the Board of County Commissioners for the first time in 20 years. Because of that change, 2 Republicans and a populist were on the New Hanover County Commission in 1898. And these are just pictures of a few of the folks who were either elected to office or appointed to office because Republicans were elected. So you might see Alexander Manley on here, and we mostly think of him as being the editor of the Daily Record, but he was also the Deputy Register of Deeds because the main Register of Deeds was a Black Republican man who appointed him. So in the spring of 1897, the Fusion government passed a new law that created the local city government form that we are experiencing as we move towards the events of 1898. This is a weird sort of time, and it's a complicated story, and I'm going to tell you a little bit of it, and I hope that you will bear with me through it. I think it helps you understand the kind of complexity of history and the messiness of history, and also the complexity of the politics in this city, in this county at that time. So March 1897, the General Assembly says, we are going to change how Wilmington's government is organized. They could do that. There's a charter, there's a law. And they created a board of aldermen with 10 men on it. 5 of them were appointed by the governor, who was a Republican, and 5 of them were elected. And these are the 10 men. And as you can see, there is a majority Republican populist. But if you look at the side of elected people, 3 of the people were white Democrats. This board then elected Silas P. Wright, who's listed there as being in the 1st Ward, as mayor, and appointed and then self-selected Harvey C. Twining, a Republican who worked for the railroad, in his place. 3 of the 10 aldermen were African American. 2 of them were elected, and 1 of them was appointed. And Andrew J. Walker is the only one I have been able to find an image of. And then there were 3 Democrats who were basically no-shows. They won the election and they never showed up to the Board of Commissioners meetings. The Board of Aldermen's meetings. And in fact, the whole thing turns into this crazy story of a municipal muddle. In the spring of summer of 1897, 4 different groups claimed to be the legitimate government of the city of Wilmington. There was the old board who said this new election didn't count, so we're still it. There was the new board that we just saw the list of. Then there was a group that claimed they were the board because they were the top 10 vote getters in that election. And then those 3 no-shows said, actually, we're the real board. We've asked our 2 African-American elected people who got elected to join us. They said no. And we say we're going to be the board. So They appointed Colonel Walker Taylor, who goes on to be the leader of the forces in town in the massacre, as the mayor of Wilmington. So there were 4 mayors and there were 4 boards. Makes today look good, right? They spent back and forth. It takes a while, but on November 16th, 1897, the state Supreme Court decides that the General Assembly has the right to decide how the board gets elected, and so the Fusion Board is legitimized as the government of Wilmington. And then, because those 3 guys never showed up, this new board said, all right, we're going to get rid of you. And they replaced them with a couple of other people. I don't know why William Springer's seat was not filled, but it wasn't. But this guy is one of the people who get replaced. So according to historian Helen Edmonds, the factors involved in the long municipal election of 1897 hover in the background of 1898. And it certainly seems that that's the case. 14 days later, the State Democratic Executive Committee, who didn't usually meet in off years when it wasn't a big election, met and announced their white supremacy campaign. It was a planned out campaign that used a number of tools to create support for white supremacy. Since the goal of the movement was to win the 1898 election, we see new forms of organization outside of the Democratic Party. So maybe you're from a Republican family and you don't really want to join a Democratic club, but you're convinced by these arguments and maybe you'll join a white government union. That was the idea behind it, trying to encourage people to join together on the basis of race. And it looks really great up here. Heather has it. It's tiny. The tiny little button, but these are mass-produced white government union buttons. There was a multi-pronged campaign to win, to use white supremacy to win the election in November of 1898. Newspaper editors, many of them with deep connections to the Democratic Party, like William H. Bernard, editor of the Wilmington Morning Star and member of the State Democratic Executive Committee in the 1890s, and Josephus Daniels also promoted the cause. They published inflammatory articles and cartoons over and over and over again. And they were helping create the space where this campaign could succeed. There were also men who could speak, and speeches at the time were a form of entertainment in an era without recorded media. And in the months up to the election, speeches were given attacking the idea of Black voting rights and excoriating Black office holders. And this is actually from Charles B. Aycock's gubernatorial acceptance speech. He uses his fame as an 1898 speaker to become governor of North Carolina. And he's saying it's not just that we have Black elected officials, it's even the idea of Black people voting is Negro domination. So they are taking this argument to an extreme. And it's not only him. We often see quotes from Alfred Moore Waddell talking about murdering people, and those are important things for us to know that he said, but he also said things like this in his speeches about it being the greatest crime against civilization, allowing African Americans the franchise. And this, as we know, is not simply a war of words. There were men with guns out on the streets around the state supporting white supremacy, known as red shirts. So let's focus a little bit on the election of 1898. So to me, it seems really ironic that it's not actually that important of an election year. There's no president on the ballot. There's no senatorial races. We are voting for our congressional representative, and these 2 guys, Dockery and Bellamy, are the candidates. There is a Republican candidate for this. And the folks at the Bellamy Museum have been looking at this a little bit more because of John D. Bellamy. And, there's a really interesting story about that case, but we're not going to go in there today. We also see 2 candidates for state office. So these are the Democratic candidates for the North Carolina House of Representatives. And there are a range of county offices on the ballot. But on October 30th, in part because of the ever-increasing tensions in the community, the Republican Party of Wilmington and New Hanover County agreed not to run candidates for local office. So on election day in Wilmington, ballot boxes were stuffed, voters were intimidated. There's at least one ward where more people voted than were registered. And there weren't any local folks to vote for if you were a Republican anyway. And it's in this context that John D. Bellamy wins a seat in Congress and all the other Democrats are voted into office. Not content with winning that election, an estimated 1,000 people attended a meeting on November 9th, 1898, and drafted a document that became known as the White Declaration of Independence. And there are 8 demands in it, but this quote really captures the essential summary of what their goals were, which was to never allow African Americans a voice in political life and economic life again. At that meeting, the group created a committee of 25, why do you remember that, to implement the White Declaration of Independence demands. And these men designated a group of African American leaders to answer this White Declaration of Independence on the morning of November 10th. White leaders claimed the reply did not arrive at its destination in the prescribed time. And on the morning of November 10th, 1898, a mob of armed white men gathered. 100 marched from the Wilmington Light Infantry building on Market Street to the Daily Records office. The crowd burned down the building, took to the streets, and on the north side of town attacked African Americans. An unknown and unknowable number of Black Wilmingtonians died that day, and other people, white and Black, were forced to leave town. And I'm not going to go into what happened at each moment today, but we do have a story map that the museum created. This is a QR code for it. I will put it up again at the end. 130,000 plus people have looked at it. And if you would like to honor those victims of the massacre, there is a wreath laying at the memorial, at the 1898 memorial at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. So on the same day as citizens were shot in the streets, the city government was pressured into resigning. Here's just a reminder of how the board was constituted. And I replaced the people who resigned and left, the 3 no-shows, with the people who actually were in office. So how did it all work? First, Mayor Wright was forced to call a special meeting, and 5 of the Fusion board were present. Alderman Gore, who seems to have backed away from the politics in the run-up to the election, white Republicans and fusionists weren't necessarily, racial justice advocates. And it seems pretty clear that he felt like he just didn't want, it's gone too far. I don't want to deal with being on the side of African Americans in the community. So 2 men were nominated to fill the empty seats. Then Alderman Andrew Jackson Hewlett resigned, and he was replaced by Charles W. Worth, who both signed the White Declaration of Independence and was a member of the Committee of 25. Charles Worth was the grandson of a North Carolina governor and was related to Josephus Daniels' wife, the editor of the News and Observer. Preston L. Bridges, who replaced Daniel Lennox Gore, was a railroad man, and he also signed the White Declaration of Independence and was a member of the Committee of 25. Benjamin King was active in the local Democratic Party. He was connected to the YMCA, and he was the county assessor. He also signed the Declaration and was a member of the Committee of 25. And he replaced D.J. Benson, who was a carpenter, a Republican carpenter. Wilmington businessman William H. Sprunt replaced Alderman John G. Norwood, who was a carpenter and the longtime president of Pine Forest Cemeteries Board. Reverend James W. Kramer replaced Alderman Harvey C. Twining. Reverend Kramer came to Wilmington in 1895. He was the president of the First Ward's White Government Union Club. He also signed the White Declaration of Independence, and he was also a member of the Committee of 25. And there's something about him that really gets to me. I think it's the being religious and then doing this stuff. That he gave a sermon the Sunday after the massacre and coup and said, God from the beginning of time intended that intelligent white men should lead the people and rule the country. I believe the whites were doing God's services as the results for good have been felt in business, in politics, and in the church. How you can say that like a few days after something is amazing, but also how you can say that in a church seems challenging. He replaced a Pennsylvania-born Republican railroad baggageman and railroad conductor. He also went on to be an evangelist who was highly popular. And when he died, nothing said anything about him being involved in a coup. Arthur Bertram Skeldon was born in Riverside, Connecticut, attended Yale, and was the general manager of the street railroad in Wilmington. He apparently knew Edison. Skelding also signed the White Declaration of Independence and was a member of the Committee of 25. He replaced Fifth Ward's African-American alderman Elijah Green. Mr. Green was a stevedore. He served on the city's police board, which was a precursor to the Fusion Board of Aldermen. So then, after that, Mayor Wright resigned. And now Alderman King nominated Waddell to become mayor. So Arthur Moore Waddell, who had stirred up racial tensions with his vitriolic speeches and marched on the Daily Record, was now mayor. And he was mayor for a number of years after the coup. So Alderman Elijah Green wasn't in the room on November 10th, but the board replaced him in absentia. But you may have noticed that not everyone was present on November 10th. And in fact, there were two guys that they had to have the coup part 2 to get rid of, which they did by calling a special meeting on November 14th, 1898. And at that time, Alderman Keith and Alderman Morrill were removed from office and replaced by Hugh McCrae, prominent Southern industrialist, who also signed the Declaration and was a member of the Committee of 25, and John Allen Taylor, who was a longtime Democrat, also a member of the Committee of 25, and who was also the president of the Chamber of Commerce in the early 20th century. So I think I said member of 25 a lot, but just to bring it home, 8 out of 10 of the men who were the aldermen after the coup both signed the Declaration of White Declaration of Independence and were a member of the Committee of 25 designed to enact that. So fully 1/3 of that committee gained political power in the wake of the massacre and coup. And these were not the only changes that we see. The city's police chief, John R. Melton, was run out of town at gunpoint and replaced by this man, Mr. Parmalee. Charles Schnibben was the only person who seems to have survived the coup. He was the fire chief before, he was the fire chief after. I've talked to the current fire chief about that, and I think we would both really like to know how that worked. But he might have survived, but fully half of the city's fire department at that time was Black, and all of those Black firemen lost their jobs in the wake of the coup. So when I first started looking at the individuals involved in this and what really happened on the city government, it was in part because of our new museum that we wanted to have that background to inform our exhibits. But it was also because I had been thinking, what was going on the county commissioners? You know, as a county employee, it's like, well, maybe we were great. Nope. This was not only the city. The county had its own version of this municipal muddle, no doubt precipitated by the white supremacy campaign. It's not quite as extra as the city government. There weren't 4 boards, but there were 2, because in April, this was our board of commissioners, as you can see, majority Republican and populist in January 1898. In the spring of that year, 3 of the 5 members, the Republicans and the populist, were kicked off the board after the Supreme Court of the state said you could not hold 2 offices at once. So generally, since about the mid-1890s, if you were a county commissioner, you were also on the county board of education. And so the local Democratic Party used that new ruling by the state Supreme Court and kicked off the members, because that ruling also said if you took the second office, you were by default resigning that first office that you held. So rather than saying to these guys, oh, look, you're not really supposed to do this. Do you want to be a commissioner, or do you want to be on the Board of Education? They made that choice for them. So we had 2 boards on the county commissioners also meeting in the spring of 1898. And they're both claiming to be the rightful commissioners. The fusion city government that we had from 1897, they're still talking to the old board of commissioners. But in the courts, by the summer of 1898, the fusion members of this board had given up trying to still remain on the board. And so we'd already had a transition from a fusion government to a white democratic, white supremacist government on the county level. They didn't have to do it by guns. They did it through the court. So I wanted to talk about these men. I think it is important for us to name the people who were in the rooms. And they definitely were the immediate beneficiaries of this coup and the white supremacy campaign. But I was surprised to find some things when I started looking at them and what happened. So all 3 of the top named men resigned from the Board of Aldermen within the month. Reverend Kramer left town to become a minister in a church of Alabama. Preston Bridges resigned, and I can't really figure out why. And Benjamin King resigned to become city, and then he became city treasurer and city clerk in the spring. So it seems like he used it as a platform to get a better job that paid him well. Preston Bridges may have just been in the room, and it turns out that they needed a body to fill that position, but he didn't necessarily want to be it. So I don't really know. I also tried to follow the men who were removed by the coup, and Mayor Wright was put on a train with a gun and made to leave town. And every other person on this list stayed in the city of Wilmington and remained a part of the community. And I'm going to say that was not what I was expecting to find based on the kind of narratives that we have heard and told about this. And so, as I hope this suggests, the effects of the coup on the individuals who are in city government were mixed. History is messy. This is not a straightforward story, and it really was a municipal muddle. Still, there were some pretty clear political outcomes of this municipal coup d'etat. This immediate change in local government triggered some long-time changes. First, we see the intensification of segregation across the state of North Carolina. And on the political front, we see the immediate and long-term removal of African American men from politics. That happens in 1898 in one day in Wilmington, and it happens 2 years later for the rest of the state of North Carolina when the population passes a constitutional amendment that doesn't specifically say Black men can't vote, but that was the point, and that is how it worked. And this is not a short-term effect. African Americans begin to regain access to voting rights after World War II. In 1961, by 1961, 69.6% of non-whites in New Hanover County were registered voters. But it wasn't until the 1970s that these changes led to conditions that led to the election of African Americans to public office.